Good evening. We're going to talk about my media clip final project for educating exceptional students. And I am Erica Carrender. First of all, we're going to talk about learning disabilities and communication disorders. There is no such typical thing as a typical student with a learning disability. Some students have strengths in areas where others have weaknesses. So, if they have a learning disability, they commonly have above average or average intelligence. Sometimes they can exhibit symptoms of depression. Their intellect can be low to moderate. They may not have an intellectual disability, so that's why it can be low to moderate. Sometimes they have higher levels of social anxiety, and they do not experience many mental health problems. When it comes to universal design for learning, they can do things such as self-questioning, where they look at questions and they ask themselves questions before they start reading a passage. That way, as they're reading, they can answer the questions. And then there are some organizational strategies that they can do. And when it comes to differentiated learning, they reduce the number of problems. And if you have a communication disorder, you can have a scribe or somebody like a teacher or something to write for the student or to read for them. Now we're going to talk about emotional and behavioral disabilities. These students cannot make interpersonal relationships. They can be friends with people, but not, close friends. They can't really come in close contact, not close contact, but they can't be around them all the time because sometimes they'll be set off with a behavior or something that they'll do that they'll get in trouble. And they have a pervasive mood, or they can be happy or unhappy, and they can be depressed. When it comes to their intellectual, you can't explain the learning of these guys because sometimes they learn well, sometimes they don't. It just depends on their behavior at that certain point and their emotion that's going on. And they have an intrinsic motivation when it comes to their academics. They use technology to regulate these students' behavior, so they can say, if you do this without any behavior issues, then you're going to get a reward of using this kind of technology. And then you can use some multi-component intervention for differentiated learning so that, you can say, okay, if you do this and this for this many days without a behavior or some blow up in emotion, then we'll get to do this with a computer, or we get to play games on an iPad or something of that sort, to try to give them the key to want to try to be better during class and not have a behavior issue. Then we have ADHD. These students are students who cannot sit still. They just got to be up moving around. They don't want to stay in their seat. And they have a really hard time regulating their emotions. And they have a full spectrum of IQ scores. Some ADHD kids can be really, really smart, and they just can't control their activity and want to sit, don't want to sit all the time. And some ADHD kids can be really, really low. Then we have, some of them have problems achieving academically. Some of them, they can concentrate enough to get their work done so that they get the academics they need. And some have to be medicated so that they are able to concentrate to receive the academics that they need. So some things for universal design that teachers can do for these type of students is have goals set. I'm going to set this goal, so we're going to get this amount of work done by this certain day. And they can self-regulate the actions of the student. So they can say, okay, now we need to sit to do this, and then, okay, we can stand up and move around to do this part of class. And then these students, some of them learn better with visual aids. so they can see the activity or the information being presented to them versus trying to read it off the board or something of that sort, or sit and listen to a lecture. Because if they're sitting and listening to a lecture, they can get really bored really quick, and then they want to get up and move around and everything. And if you do a group project, they're better off in small groups so that, there's less people to have to really not necessarily interact with, but less people to have to, them to have to move around and talk to and everything. And then with these students, you can also use timers. So you set a timer for a designated amount of time, and they have to get their work done or that activity done in that amount of time, or there is a consequence. Now we're going to go on to intellectual disabilities and autism. They have limited activity. Some autistic students are nonverbal, some are verbal. It just depends on where they are at on the spectrum. And intellectual disabilities are about the same. They have a very low state of cognition, and they are limited functioning for the intellectual disabilities. And the autistic disabilities, they can have all different levels. It just depends on where they're at on the spectrum. And when it comes to their academics, it depends on the level of their disability as to how they can achieve academically. And with intellectual disabilities, sometimes for universal design of learning, they'll use e-readers so that the students can have the stuff read to them, or they have like a book on a tablet or a computer so that it's easier for them to see, to read, versus being in paper where they can manipulate with their own hands versus just they can follow along easier, and sometimes you can make it bigger because sometimes they need to see bigger print. And then for the autistic kids, you can have a curriculum adaptation. And this is where you adapt the curriculum to fit the level of autism that the student has. And when it comes to intellectual disabilities, for when you want to differentiate learning, it's better off to teach them skills that will be effective in their home or community after they get out of school, so that they are able, or that is going on while they're in school, so they are able to function on a daily basis outside of school. And when it comes to the autistic children, you can have social stories, which are stories that say, this, we're going to do this today, or this is how this person does this. Now we're on to the next one, which is a traumatic brain injury and hearing loss. Sometimes with the TBI, the traumatic brain injury, the students can get upset in class, and so then they have to leave the room so that they are able to recompose themselves and not make an outburst during class. And with the hearing loss, sometimes they can communicate, but they can't understand if it's a significant enough hearing loss, they cannot understand what is being said to them. And they have memory problems, both ends. And so you're going to use some planning and some reasoning and some problem solving to help with the traumatic brain injury when it comes to cognition. They have a low to average IQ score, and their academics depend on the extent of the injury. If it's a really, really bad injury, their academics may not be very well. But if it's just a small, minor injury, then they can recover from that, and their academics will recover quickly, or as they work at it. And then for universal design of learning, we can change how the information is presented. Because some students with a traumatic brain injury, they can't sit and listen to all that information. And with a hearing loss, you're not going to want to sit and listen to all that information if you cannot hear it. So we want to deliver this information in smaller pieces so they are able to process it better. So and for differentiated learning, we're going to have smaller bits of information at one time so that they don't have to process a large amount of information because their brain has been affected by the injury. Then we have visual impairment and gifted or talented students. And the visually impaired and the gifted and talented, they have very low anxiety and depression. The gifted and talented, they are superior functioning due to the memory and concentration and reasoning and generalization that they have. Gifted students have very high IQs. Um, so they're very good students academically because they're very concerned about their work, and they want to achieve more than what is supposed to be done for their grade level. So you can do a curriculum extension for a UDL. This allows the students to take a higher math class per se, or a science class other than what is being supposed to be taken for their grade. And then you can use the application of taxonomy for a lesson plan. And then you're going to implement, for a differentiated learning, you're going to implement matching strengths and needs for the student. Some of the interesting things that I learned in this class was, it was really neat to learn about the traumatic brain injury, because I have a child that has had multiple concussions, and trying to get him to understand the fact that yes, there really is something that needs to be done, because he has a 504 due to this, and he thinks I'm trying to use it as a crutch. But in all reality, he needs that so that his brain can heal and he can continue on with life. And then I also have two children who have ADHD, which we medicate them. But it was very interesting to learn all the different information and all the different types about ADHD. I really enjoyed doing the presentation over ADHD. And then I didn't realize how much differentiated learning was. And it was really neat, and I've used that in the classroom as I've been working with students here lately as to the differentiated learning, to try to figure out what works best for them to learn the information at hand. So I hope you all enjoyed my presentation. Have a good evening.